Be live beginning at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3.
Order. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3304.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3304, a bill to authorize and request the President to award the Medal of Honor to Benny G. Atkins and Donald P. Sloat of the United States Army for acts of valor during the Vietnam conflict, and to authorize the award of the Medal of Honor to certain other veterans who were previously recommended for award of the Medal of Honor.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, and the gentlewoman from Guam, Ms. Bodeo, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which they can revise and extend remarks and insert extraneous material to the bill, which I will have one during this presentation.
Without objection.
The bill under consideration.
Without objection. Without objection. Gentleman is recognized.
Say what?
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 3304. This bill would waive the time limit for the President to consider awarding the Medal of Honor to a handful of American heroes. The battlefield actions of these brave Americans have undergone a thorough review by the Department of Defense and have been determined to merit consideration for our nation's highest honor. Among those heroes that would be considered on this bill are Mr. Benny Atkins of Opelika, Alabama. In 1966, while serving in Vietnam, then Sergeant First Class Benny Atkins was assigned to Special Forces Detachment A-102 at Special Forces Camp Ashall in the Republic of Vietnam. From March 9 to March 12 of that year, he displayed extraordinary bravery during a sustained and well-coordinated attack from a determined, vicious, and highly lethal Viet Cong force. Though recommended at the time by his chain of command for the Medal of Honor, he received instead the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. His citation read, quote, "When the camp was attacked by a large Viet Cong force, Sergeant First Class Atkins rushed through intense hostile fire and manned a mortar position. Although he was wounded, he ran through exploding mortar rounds and dragged several of his comrades to safety. When the hostile fire subsided, Sergeant First Class Atkins exposed himself to sporadic sniper fire and carried his wounded comrades to the camp dispensary. During the evacuation, seriously wounded American Sergeant First Class Atkins maneuvered outside the camp walls to draw fire and successfully covered the rescue. During the early morning hours of 10 March 1966, a Viet Cong regiment launched their main attack. Within 2 hours, Sergeant First Class Atkins was the only man firing a mortar weapon. Although he was painfully wounded and most of his crew was killed or wounded, he fought off fanatical waves of attacking Viet Cong. After withdrawing to a communications bunker where several Americans were attempting to fight off a company of Viet Cong, Sergeant First Class Atkins killed numerous insurgents with his suppressive fire. Running extremely low on ammunition, he returned to the mortar pit, gathered the vital ammunition, and ran through intense fire back to the communications bunker. After being ordered to evacuate the camp, all signal equipment and classified documents were destroyed. Sergeant First Class Atkins and his small group of men fought their way out of the camp and evaded the Viet Cong for 2 days until they were rescued by helicopter. Sergeant First Class Atkins' extraordinary heroism in close combat against numerically superior hostile force was in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army." Close quote. Mr. Adkins continued his stellar military career until he retired in 1977 at the rank of Sergeant Major. Mr. Adkins also served a term as the National Commander of the Legion of Valor. Following a thorough review of Mr. Adkins' actions in the battle by the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense Hagel recently wrote to Congress that Mr. Adkins' actions merited the Medal of Honor and Congress should waive the time requirement. If Congress would waive the time requirement, he would recommend to President Obama that the President should award the Medal of Honor to Mr. Adkins. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to offer a letter from Secretary Hagel via unanimous consent for the record.
Without objection.
This bill would allow Mr. Donald. This bill would also allow Mr. Donald Sloat to be considered for the Medal of Honor. On January 17, 1970, while serving in Vietnam, then Specialist Donald Sloat, a machine gunner with Company D, 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment, 196 Light Infantry, American Division. He was killed saving the lives of his squad members by drawing enemy grenade into his body and shielding them from the blast. For his ultimate sacrifice to save his fellow soldiers, the DoD determined that Mr. Sloat's actions merited consideration for the Medal of Honor. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to commend the Department of Defense for completing the review of Jewish and Hispanic American veterans going back to World War II to correct an injustice to deserving members of our military who risked their lives for our country but whose actions were overlooked due to their ethnicity and religion. While conducting this review, the Department discovered 7 individuals who did not meet the exact criteria of the congressionally mandated review, but nevertheless were deserving of the Medal of Honor. This bill would allow them to be recognized with the nation's highest award of valor. It is important to note that none of these brave Americans asked for this renewed consideration. It was through the advocacy and admiration of loved ones and those that served with them that led to this effort. For those brave Americans who show such extraordinary heroism in defense of our liberties, it is never too late to say thank you. Mr. Adkins and Mr. Sloat and all the brave Americans like them, to them I say thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Guam is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 3304, introduced by my friend and my colleague, Mr. Deutsch from Florida. H.R. 3304 authorized the President of the United States to award the Medal of Honor to Benny G. Atkins, Donald P. Sloat, Melvin Morris, Artie Kopis, Jack Weinstein, Leonard Kravitz, Alfred Neitzel, Donald Schwab, and William Leonard. These individuals, Mr. Speaker, have distinguished themselves in service to our nation in previous conflicts, ranging from World War II to Vietnam. The individuals were reviewed by the appropriate services, and their nominations were given careful consideration by the Secretary of Defense, and their names have been submitted to the Congress. Section 3744 of Title 10 United States Code requires the Medal of Honor to be awarded within 3 years after the date of the act justifying the award, which is why we are here on the floor to seek a statutory time waiver to allow the President of the United States to award the Medal of Honor to these particular individuals. So I urge my colleagues to support the passage of this important legislation. And thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Speaker, I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. Gentlewoman from Guam. Does he have additional speakers?
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes, or as much time as he wishes to consume, to the gentleman from Florida and the author of this bill, Mr. Deutsch.
Mr. Deutsch.
I thank my friend, the gentlelady from Guam. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 3304. I was pleased to work with my colleagues, Mr. Rogers of Alabama, Mr. Breinstein of Oklahoma, and Mr. Rooney of Florida on this bill, and I appreciate the work that they do on behalf of our veterans and the men and women who serve our country today. This legislation will waive the time limitation to allow the award of the Medal of Honor to two brave men, Benny Atkins, a constituent of Mr. Rogers, and Donald Sloat, a constituent of Mr. Bridenstine's. I sincerely appreciate my colleagues' support and the support of the House Armed Services Committee in the effort to bring this legislation to the floor today. This legislation will also allow the award of the Medal of Honor to several other deserving veterans. This bill represents the culmination of a long fight to remedy discrimination against Jewish American and Hispanic American veterans of our armed forces who, in spite of their acts of valor, above and beyond the call of duty, may have been overlooked and deserving of the Medal of Honor. Over 12 years ago, this important effort began because Mitch Libman, a close friend of Leonard Kravitz, made it known that then Private First Class Kravitz may have been improperly bypassed for the Medal of Honor. After sacrificing his life in combat in Korea, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross with the following citation. Upon order to withdraw, Private Kravitz voluntarily remained to provide protective fire for the retiring elements. Traversing the gun to the left to cover the infiltrating enemy and ignoring the pleadings of his comrades to fall back, he fearlessly maintained his position. Detecting a column of communist troops moving toward friendly positions, he swept the hostile soldiers with deadly accurate fire, killing the entire group. His destructive retaliation caused the enemy to concentrate vicious fire on his position and enabled the friendly elements to effect a withdrawal. Leonard Kravitz bravely gave his life for the men fighting at his side and for his country. In spite of his acts of valor, above and beyond the call of duty, Kravitz was not awarded the Medal of Honor. In fact, when Mr. Libman came forward to share Mr. Kravitz's story, no Jewish American veteran had been recommended to receive the Medal of Honor for service in Korea. To ensure that this disparity was not the result of discrimination, Congress required each military department to conduct a review of veteran files to identify any deserving veteran who may have been overlooked for the Medal of Honor. This review has ensured that our highest military honor will be awarded based only on the acts of valor and courage displayed in battle, and that no veteran will be denied the Medal of Honor as a result of his or her religion, race, or heritage. I'm extremely proud of the long, rich history of Jewish Americans and Hispanic Americans serving in our armed forces. Over 500,000 Jewish Americans fought for the United States in World War II, and 11,000 of them perished while fighting for this country. Jewish Americans have served with distinction in Korea, Vietnam, Operation Desert Storm, and countless other missions around the globe. Hispanic Americans have a proud history of military service, stretching back to the Revolutionary War. Over 1 million Latino veterans have served courageously in our armed forces. Hispanic Americans and Jewish Americans are among the brave young men and women who have stepped forward to serve our nation in our most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Members of both of these communities have fought for America's freedom and have had to fight to ensure they receive the respect and honor they are owed for their service. The review of hundreds of service records resulted in the recommendation of the award of the Medal of Honor to at least 7 veterans, including Mr. Kravitz. I want to thank all of those at the Department of Defense who diligently reviewed their records to make certain that we properly recognize all of the brave veterans deserving of the Medal of Honor. The President of the United States, Mr. Speaker, has awarded the Medal of Honor to 3,471 of our finest Americans over the course of our nation's history. With the passage of this bill, the President will be authorized to add Benny G. Atkins, Donald B. Sloat, and at least 7 other veterans whose heroic acts can at last receive the highest honor that they richly deserve. I strongly urge my colleagues to support the passage of this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I have no further requests to speak, so I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time and close with an urging to my colleagues that they vote in favor of this bill. And I've yielded back to the panel.
Gentlelady from Guam.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, but I do want to commend the author of this bill, this very worthwhile piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Guam yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Alabama yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3304 as amended? No. Not as amended, but just as was presented. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Does the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1742.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1742, a bill to exclude from consideration as income under the United States Housing Act of 1937 payments of pension made under Section 1521 of Title 38 United States Code to veterans who are in need of regular aid and attendance and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, and the gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Carney, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous material for the record on H.R. 1742, currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1742, the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act of 2013, bipartisan legislation that ensures fairness in housing assistance made available to our veterans who have borne the physical costs of service to the country. First, H.R. 1742 amends current law to exempt expenses related to a veteran's in-home aid and attendance care payments from qualifying as income when determining their eligibility and payments from HUD programs. The in-home aid and attendance care benefit is an enhanced pension program provided by the VA to severely disabled wartime veterans who make less than $12,256 per year. These pensions are provided out of medical necessity and should not be considered disposable income. Including them in income calculations skews eligibility and wrongly reduces the housing assistance that would otherwise be available to thousands of disabled veterans. The Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act also improves the way utility allowances are calculated by instructing public housing authorities to base payments on family size, that is, the number of people benefiting from a payment, rather than the current standard of dwelling size. Using this approach ensures, for instance, a family of 4 living in a one-bedroom apartment will not receive less in utility allowance than a single individual living in a 2-bedroom apartment. These housing reforms have broad support from state and local housing agencies, low-income housing advocates, and for-profit and non-profit affordable housing providers. Mr. Speaker, many of our current veterans assistance programs are flawed. They spend too much and they help too few. Fortunately, the CBO estimates the reforms in this bill will save almost $50 million over 5 years while helping thousands of veterans obtain the appropriate housing assistance. Sadly, homelessness affects over 60,000 veterans nationwide and approximately 1,000 in my home state of Arkansas. These numbers are unacceptable. As a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan, I understand not only the difficulties faced while serving in the military, but also the struggles that too many encounter upon returning to civilian life, especially with a life-altering disability. These men and women have put their lives on the line for our country. We should be doing all we can to support them, not making it harder for them to obtain assistance. I'm grateful to my colleague and fellow veteran, Congressman Joe Heck, and the Financial Services Committee for their work on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and our disabled veterans, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Delaware is recognized for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. About a year ago, I talked to a young Marine from Magnolia, Delaware, in my district. He had been wounded in Afghanistan. He was home recovering. I called him really just to wish him well and to see how he was doing. And this Marine was not focused on his injuries. All he could think about and talk to me about was getting back to his base. Mr. Speaker, as members of Congress, we need to be worthy of this Marine's sacrifice, his selflessness, and his dedication to fighting for his country. Our nation's most sacred obligation is to care for our men and women in uniform, both when they're serving abroad and when they come back home. Unfortunately, today we're falling short of this duty. Today, about 60,000 veterans are homeless. Close to 13,000 of these are veterans from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. While veterans represent only 7% of the U.S. population, they represent 13% of homeless Americans. These numbers are just unacceptable. That's why I was pleased to join with my colleagues and friends, Mr. Heck and Mr. Renacci, in introducing the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act of 2013. We're all part of a bipartisan working group that meets a couple times a month, and we've come up with a number of common sense ideas just like that, like this. Mr. Delaney and Mr. Renacci have another bill later on today. Simply put, the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act ensures that veterans who need and deserve housing assistance get it. Right now, those veterans who are struggling the most, those who are severely disabled and have virtually no income, receive a benefit from the VA to cover the cost of their care. This benefit goes to caretakers who help our veterans with the daily tasks of living, bathing, eating, maintaining prosthetics. The list goes on. However, when these same veterans go to apply for housing assistance from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, this aid counts as income, making it harder for them to qualify for housing assistance. This policy just doesn't make sense, and it's hurting our veterans. H.R. 1742, the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act, fixes this problem so that our severely disabled veterans aren't victims of homelessness as well. It excludes this aid, meant to address the health and daily living needs of severely disabled veterans, from the calculation of income in the Housing Assistance Program. Mr. Speaker, often when members come in through the doors of the House chambers to vote, we're greeted by members of our military who have been wounded in service of our nation. Most have lost limbs, and all their lives are irreparably changed. Despite all they've already given, these men and women come to our nation's capital to continue giving back and to inspire and thank us. We should thank them. As we approach Veterans Day, I hope the House will honor their sacrifice by passing legislation that will make life just a little easier for those who have given so much to protect ours. I know my colleagues on both sides of the aisle recognize this is a critical issue. A similar version of this bill passed the House by voice vote in the last Congress, and I urge my colleagues to pass this bill once again for the sake of our nation's most vulnerable veterans. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Delaware reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arkansas.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from Nevada, a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, and soon to be Brigadier General Dr. Heck.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my brother veteran, gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, and my friend from the state of Delaware, Mr. Carney, for joining me in support of H.R. 1742, this bipartisan bill, the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act of 2013. As has been stated, this bill would remove an unnecessary barrier that prevents our disabled wartime veterans from receiving the housing assistance they so critically need. This body recognized the importance of this issue when it unanimously passed a substantially similar bill, H.R. 6361, the Vulnerable Veterans Housing Reform Act of 2012, which I introduced last year. Unfortunately, that legislation was not considered by the Senate prior to the conclusion of the 112th Congress. Quite simply, H.R. 1742 prevents the Department of Housing and Urban Development from considering a veteran's aid and attendance benefits as income when calculating their need and eligibility for housing assistance. The aid and attendance benefit is an enhanced pension provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs to our nation's wartime veterans who are severely disabled and have little or no income. Veterans eligible for this benefit are those requiring the aid of another person in order to perform their activities of daily living. In order to receive this benefit, a veteran must first establish his or her eligibility for a low-income pension, which requires an annual adjusted gross income of less than $12,256 for a single veteran with no dependents. Once eligibility is determined, the low-income disabled veteran can receive roughly an additional $8,000 in aid and attendance benefits annually to help defray the cost of their medical care. Now, this is an important point. The aid and attendance benefit is for medical care. It is not discretionary income. It cannot be used for groceries or utilities or transportation. As you can imagine, these low-income veterans struggle daily to keep the lights on, put food on the table, and to keep a roof over their heads. Add to that the cost of paying for a personal care attendant, and it becomes increasingly difficult for them to stay in their homes. Now, the Department of Housing and Urban Development operates a number of programs to assist these veterans, but current regulations require that the aid and attendance benefit be counted as income when determining eligibility for housing assistance. Mr. Speaker, this makes no sense. The VA provides this benefit to ensure that our low-income disabled wartime vets have the necessary resources to receive the medical care they need and that they have earned. While $8,000 per year may seem like a substantial amount of money, it doesn't fully cover the cost of a full-time aide, but is much more cost-effective than placing the veteran in a nursing home or assisted living facility. Continuing to count the aid and attendance benefit as income does nothing more than to reduce the housing assistance available to our low-income disabled vets and jeopardizes their very ability to live independently. Mr. Speaker, it's the stated goal of both this House and this administration to reduce homelessness in our veteran population, and the need for this legislative fix is just as strong today as it was last year. Most recent statistics estimate that approximately 63,000 veterans across America are homeless. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1742 will go a long way toward preventing homelessness for our nation's veterans, and I urge my colleagues to support this critical legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
And yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Delaware.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further requests for time. I just would like to thank the sponsors, Mr. Heck, Mr. Renacci, and other veterans, Mr. Cotton, the members of from the Democratic side who have co-sponsored this, and all the members of the House who supported this the last time, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arkansas.
I want to thank the gentleman from Delaware as well as the gentleman from Nevada and everybody in this institution that helps serve our veterans every single day. I have no further requests for speakers and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arkansas yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules, pass the bill H.R. 1742? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2189 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 171, H.R. 2189, a bill to establish a commission or task force to evaluate the backlog of disability claims of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michaud, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much. I ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days with which to revise and extend their remarks and add any extraneous material they may have on H.R. 2189.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
One of the most challenging issues facing the Department of Veterans Affairs and the veterans it serves is the huge disability backlog. According to last week's backlog report, there were 717,000 claims for disability compensation waiting for a decision, and almost 412,000, or 57% of those claims, were above the Secretary's stated processing goal of 125 days. In short, 57% of VA's claims work is currently backlogged. Although I'm glad we've seen some progress of late, a 57% backlog is not acceptable. If we're going to reach the Secretary's goal of ending the backlog by 2015, we'll all need a focused effort, and the provisions of this bill will help achieve that goal. Now, H.R. 2189 as amended reflects the committee's bipartisan efforts to bring additional transparency to this very troubling and decades-old problem. I know that other members are here to provide a brief description of the bill's provisions that they've sponsored or those that have worked closely on this legislation, but I want to highlight some of the key provisions. Title I would establish a commission or a task force to evaluate the backlog of disability claims and the appeals process related to those claims. Time is of the essence, so the Commission would be required to submit a series of interim reports to Congress and a final report to the President and to the Congress 180 days after the Commission's first meeting. The purpose of the task force is very simple. We need the best and the brightest minds to put forward workable solutions that can be implemented immediately. Even though VA has made recent progress, it's still well short of its own goals. We must not take our foot off the gas when it comes to ending the backlog once and for all. And ideas coming from this focused task force will assist in that effort. Title I of the bill would also direct VA to provide a supplemental report to its strategic plan to eliminate the compensation claims backlog within 60 days of enactment and every 120 days thereafter until the 25th of May, 2015. Now, the purpose of this provision is to hold VA accountable for the full execution of its own strategic plan. Too often, VA has made lofty promises and its efforts have fallen short. This provision, authored by our Majority Whip, will verify progress every single step of the way. Title II of the bill would extend and expand VA's authority to use contract examinations during its disability examination process. VA's use of contract providers serves two purposes. First, because quality and timely exams are an essential component of the claims process, having additional providers to assist in the effort is critical. Second, use of non-VA examiners frees up the time that VA medical professionals can spend treating veterans at clinics and at hospitals. And finally, Title III would require the Secretary of Defense to catalog all Vietnam-era ships as serving in either blue or brown water for purposes of awarding service connection on a presumptive basis to veterans potentially exposed to Agent Orange. Currently, only veterans serving in the inland waterways or brown waters of Vietnam are eligible for compensation on a presumptive basis. The problem is that some vessels which served offshore in the blue waters of Vietnam sent smaller vessels inshore. Without an accurate cataloging of these visits, compensation may unfairly be denied to deserving veterans. This provision will assist VA in making accurate decisions in this sensitive area. Enactment of H.R. 2189 will not completely solve the claims backlog, but I do think it's a good step in the right direction. I want to thank the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Runyon, and his ranking member, Ms. Titus, for their hard work in moving this bill through the subcommittee as well. Everybody on the committee worked together in bringing this piece of legislation to the floor tonight. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves the balance of time. The gentleman from Maine is recognized for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 2189 as amended and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 2189 as amended is a bipartisan omnibus bill addressing veterans' disability benefits and compensation. This bill includes provisions from 9 other measures. This bill are part of the slate of common sense legislation introduced in May of this year. It provides the Department of Veterans Affairs with additional tools and reforms to assist in eliminating the backlog. Included are provisions from H.R. 2086, the Pay-As-You-Rate Act, introduced by the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Subcommittee ranking member, Representative Titus of Nevada, H.R. 1809, the Faster Filing Act, introduced by Representative O'Rourke from Texas, H.R. 1623, the Claims Efficiency Through Information Act, introduced by Representative Negrete McLeod of California, H.R. 1759, introduced by Representative Ruiz of California, H.R. 1805, the Veterans Claims Efficiency Through Automation Act, introduced by Representative Custer of New Hampshire, H.R. 1824, the VA Regional Office Accountability Act, introduced by Representative Ming of New York, and finally, H.R. 1521, the Disability Veterans Red Tape Reduction Act, introduced by Representative Sean Patrick Maloney of New York, and H.R. 864, which was designated at least one city in the United States each year as an American World War II city, introduced by Representative McIntyre of North Carolina, and H.R. 1288, the World War II Merchant Mariner Service Act, introduced by Representative Butterfield of North Carolina. Collectively, H.R. 2189, as amended, gives VA real, useful tools they can begin using now. These tools will assist the Department of Veterans Affairs in making significant progress on its goal of eliminating the backlogs in 2015. The legislation will require VA to pay veterans more quickly. It will provide them with information that may lead to veterans receiving a quicker decision on their claims, and it will formulate a task force to attack the growing appeals backlog, and it will require VA to start tracking information that will help them better understand the claims inventory. I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for their bipartisan effort to create a smart, programmatic solution. Together, we'll help VA provide better benefits and services to our veterans. I also want to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle for their work on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2189 as amended. I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maine reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman who chairs the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Runyon.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Chairman Miller for yielding to me. As Chairman of the House Veterans Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, I am keenly aware of the most critical issues impacting our nation's veterans. In the severe veterans claims backlog. Recently, the Department of Veterans Affairs reported that it had a backlog of more than 400,000 veterans benefits claims as the fiscal year ended in September. This is simply unacceptable. To help speed the veterans claim process, we must look at every phase of that process. One of the first steps in this process is the medical exam to determine benefit eligibility. That is why earlier this year I introduced H.R. 2423, the Disabled Veterans Access to Medical Exams Improvement Act, that provisions of which are now contained within Section 201 of H.R. 2189. This section would extend the authority of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to enter into contracts with private physicians and conduct veterans' medical disability evaluations. With its passage, this bill would this successful program, allowing physicians outside the VA to conduct contract examinations, would continue for an additional 3 years till 2016. This would allow VA to more quickly evaluate veterans' disability and facilitate quicker access to the care that they need. Second, this bill would also extend license portability to contract examination providers, meaning that physicians with an active state license may provide C&P exams in other states because they are working on behalf of the federal government. Although the VA and DoD already provide license portability for physicians working directly for them, this authority is not extended to C&P examination providers. This provision is designed to facilitate the C&P examination process by allowing contract physicians flexibility to travel and assist in areas that are experiencing lengthy delays in scheduling examinations. Finally, this piece of legislation would also expand the number of VA regional offices that would utilize contract examinations from 10 to 15. These medical examinations are a key component of the disability claims process. By expanding the authority and scope of the contract examinations process, Veterans would receive nearly necessary medical evidence for their claim.
The gentleman will suspend.
And this
Yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 30
Thank you,
seconds.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman. This would reduce the overall claim development processing time, resulting in the faster issuance of final medical decision for the claim. Mr. Speaker, I support H.R. 2189 as amended to include my provision and encourage all members to support this important bill for veterans, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Nevada, Representative Titus.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Michaud, for yielding to me. As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, I strongly support the bill before us, the Omnibus Bill H.R. 2189. This legislation includes my bill, H.R. 2086, the Pay-As-You-Rate Act, which would require the VA to pay benefits to veterans as individual components of their claims are reviewed rather than at the completion of the entire claim. Currently, veterans typically receive payments when all medical conditions within a claim are fully adjudicated. Veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan average 8.5 components in their claims. While some of these are very complex and time-consuming, other components are simpler. The Pay-As-You-Rate Act will require the VA to pay veterans as individual medical conditions are adjudicated, providing tens of thousands of veterans and their families much-needed financial support while the VA continues to work on the more complex aspects of their claims. I thank Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Michaud, and Chairman Runyon for including this provision and other Democratic bills in this legislation. Collectively, the legislation before us today should assist VA in its continued effort to transform the claims process from mountains of paper to a more efficient, effective electronic system. In just the past few months, the VA has made great strides in serving our nation's heroes by reducing the benefits backlog. The VA has set ambitious goals, and Congress should work to support those efforts. More needs to be done, and it needs to be done quickly to ensure that veterans receive the benefits they have earned in a timely fashion. I'm also pleased to have worked with Chairman Miller on some of the task force provisions of this legislation. The provision that I added at the full committee markup would improve the proposed task force by including a subcommittee to look at the appeals process. While the VA is making significant progress in reducing the backlog, it's important that we're not creating a new backlog of appeals in the years to come. This subcommittee would be charged with making recommendations aimed at preventing that future backlog of appeals. So I thank you, I support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her. And the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from the 17th District in the state of Florida, the gentleman from Okeechobee, Mr. Rudy.
The gentleman is recognized for, a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the Veterans Pension Protection Act as part of this important legislation. Last year, veterans groups came to my office with a problem called pension poaching that targets retired veterans. Currently, the VA only considers income at the time a veteran applies for benefits, meaning it can't determine if an applicant has diverted assets to qualify for benefits. Under this scam, unethical financial advisors and firms prey on elderly veterans by promising to help them qualify for VA pensions benefits if they divert their assets into trusts or annuities and charge excessive fees for their services. GAO has identified this fraud as a major weakness in the VA pension program, leaving taxpayers and retired veterans on the hook. My bill imposes a 36-month look-back period that would track veterans' incomes to determine if they are truly eligible. This will discourage financial predators from duping elderly veterans, helping reduce the claims backlog, and ensure that low-income individuals for whom the program was intended are not robbed of their benefits. I want to thank Congressman Schrader, Bill Arakis, and Barber for their work on this bill, and especially Chairman Miller for including it as part of this package to improve services for our nation's veterans. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Representative Negrete McLeod.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Michaud. I rise in support of 2189. H.R. 2189 includes provisions from the VA Claims Efficiency Through Information Act of 2013, which I introduced in April, that will require VA to track the time spent evaluating each medical condition in a disability compensation claim. VA would have to report the number of completed claims by region and by medical condition for the current and preceding month and year. As Veterans Day approaches, we should remember veterans who are struggling to find work while living with service-connected disabilities. VA compensation is needed so veterans can support themselves and avoid homelessness. The VA's legacy paper system has made it difficult to process claims of older veterans who need additional compensation later in life. Claims of younger veterans can also take longer to process because they have multiple medical conditions. The claims backlog is a serious problem for the VA and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Since July, the Los Angeles Regional Office has reduced the average time to process claims from 600 days to 400 days. VA still has a long way to go to meet its own goal of 125 days, and the backlog will not end overnight and may even go up as more men and women apply for benefits. No one is looking at directing blame, but instead searching for a way to work together, and with Congress and the VA must be willing to explore new methods for delivering services to veterans in the 21st century for the growing veteran population. And I thank Mr. Miller for allowing my bill to be included in his. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield to the chairman of the subcommittee on oversight and investigation, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman, a minute and a half.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Michaud for their leadership on the committee and their commitment to maintaining strong oversight over the VA and their goal to reduce the backlog. During my time on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I've enjoyed the strong bipartisanship and the committee's dedication to get results for our veterans. Whether it is between Ranking Member Kirkpatrick and I on the Oversight Subcommittee, or Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Michaud on the full committee, we all share the same desire to help our veterans and do everything we can to help the VA operate more efficiently and effectively. Fortunately for our veterans, this desire to help goes beyond the Veterans Affairs Committee and is present in the entire House of Representatives. Earlier this year, I, along with 150 members of the House, sent a letter to the President urging his immediate action to reduce this backlog. Today, the House will have another opportunity to show its unity for veterans in passing House Resolution 2189. This bill will aid the VA by establishing a task force to evaluate the backlog of veterans' disability claims, ensuring the VA will find innovative ways to reduce the backlog. Currently, there are over 400,000 claims that have been waiting for over 150 days to process. Although the VA has made some progress recently, the pace is still too slow for many veterans. 30 seconds.
Jones recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Although the VA has made some progress recently, the pace is still too slow for many of our veterans waiting for their claims to be processed. As a Marine Corps combat veteran, I am proud to join my colleagues on the House Veterans Affairs Committee to urge the passage of H.R. 2189. There are nearly 400,000 veterans in Colorado, and these men and women need Washington to step up and help the VA to reduce the backlog. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Representative Custer.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Michaud, and our chair. As a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, I was proud that we worked together to draft this bipartisan legislative package to help get veterans' claims settled faster and more efficiently. Today, I'm happy to join my colleagues from both sides of the aisle in passing this package, which includes my bill, the Veterans Claims Efficiency Through Automation Act. This common-sense legislation will push the VA to focus on the greater use of automation to boost efficiency and settle claims faster. As our service members and veterans transition back to civilian life, it is imperative that the VA and the DoD continue to collaborate on improving the delivery of care, eliminating the claims backlog, and mitigating the impact of sequestration. It's simply unacceptable that so many of our heroic veterans are unable to get timely access to the care and services that they've earned. This bill is an important step toward addressing this problem, and I will keep fighting to end the backlog until the job is done. We owe it to our men and women in uniform, to our veterans, and to our military families to do all that we can to ensure that their benefits and other services transfer from the Department of Defense to the Veterans Administration. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure effective and timely collaboration between the two departments and to eliminate this claims backlog once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the gentleman from Kinderhook, New York. 1 minute, Mr. Gibson.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in support of the bill. I thank the chairman, the ranking member, all the members of the committee and the staff for their work. Our veterans deserve our very best effort, and it's simply taken too long to process these claims. We've got to do better. I believe this bill will take a step in the right direction. I also appreciate the leadership of this committee, including one of my bills, along with this bill. I've been working on supporting our Vietnam veterans who've been exposed to Agent Orange since arriving here. As the chairman mentioned, if you served on the ground or in the riverine Navy, you get presumed coverage. But if you serve just offshore, you don't get that presumed coverage. I believe that needs to change. I have a bill to do that. But until such time that policy change, I believe the DoD and the VA need to be better organized so that we can work this on a case-by-case basis, which is what we're doing right now. And the leadership was kind enough to include that bill in this effort. So I think we're going to make a positive difference. I do want to give a shout-out to a couple ladies in upstate New York making a difference, Carol Olzanowski and Susie Ballinger for the work that they've done on this, and we're going to continue to work it together. And so I urge support of this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Representative O'Rourke.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this legislation, which will help us to reduce the unacceptably long wait times for our veterans who are waiting to hear back on service-connected disability claims. In El Paso, Texas, I have the honor of representing almost 80,000 veterans. And right now, their average wait time out of the Waco Regional Office is nearly 460 days to hear back on a service-connected disability claim. I visited that office not too long ago and witnessed people carrying around the claims files for single veterans in hand trucks with the files and the paperwork measuring 3 to 4 feet in some cases. That is why, along with Paul Cook, I introduced bipartisan legislation earlier this year to work with no cost to reduce that wait time by informing veterans of the average wait time to file a disability claim amongst all available methods, from the slowest, which is an incomplete paper-based claim, to the fastest, which is a fully developed claim filed online. I'm pleased that this legislation in Section 109 includes this bill called the Faster Filing Act. I'm convinced it will help us to get our veterans the response and the time that they deserved. After all, they have sacrificed their health, their security, and their safety for ours. We need to meet our end of the obligation. I want to thank the Chairman, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member Michaud, I want to thank Mr. Brown from the committee staff and Aaron Snow from my legislative team for helping to write the legislation. And I encourage all of my colleagues in the House to pass this without delay. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, it's my honor to recognize the gentleman from the 12th District of Pennsylvania for 1 minute, Mr. Rothfuss.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 2189. This legislation is an important step forward in addressing and resolving the VA's disability claims backlog. We owe our veterans a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid. Unfortunately, veterans in western Pennsylvania and around the nation are forced to endure excessive wait times for their disability claims to be processed. That is unacceptable, and our veterans deserve better. Finding ways to better serve our veterans is one of my top priorities in Congress. The legislation we are considering today increases reporting and oversight, improves coordination between the VA and other federal agencies, provides more training for VA claims processors, and establishes a task force to look for other ways to address the backlog. Together, these actions will bring transparency and accountability to the VA, all in an effort to improve customer service to our veterans and their families. I thank the House Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman Jeff Miller, Ranking Member Michaud, Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy for their leadership, and I look forward to continuing to work with them to find better ways to serve our veterans. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I want to thank the ranking member for yielding me his time, and also I want to thank Chairman Miller for his hard work on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2189. This legislation takes important steps to address the deplorable disability claims backlog at the Veterans Affairs Administration. It does so by establishing a special task force to evaluate the full extent of the backlog and, more importantly, to determine solutions to eliminate the backlog. We all agree our veterans deserve better. And it is this same spirit that I introduced H.R. 2185, the Veterans Day Moment of Silence Act. This bill brings together all Americans to observe 2 minutes of silence each Veterans Day. It's a time when we all, regardless of ideology, can stop and reflect on the brave service of generations of U.S. veterans. I want to thank Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Michaud for including the text of my bill into the text of H.R. 2189. Particularly, I want to thank Daniel and Michael Bennetson and their father, Dr. Peter Bennetson. As a family, they've worked relentlessly to bring the moment of silence provision to fruition, and I'm honored to present this proposal today on their behalf in this 113th Congress. Again, I'm thankful to Mr. Michaud and to Chairman Miller for enabling this provision to come to a vote today, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2189. It is a very timely bill with hundreds of thousands of returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and with over 700,000 veterans waiting for disability determinations. It again is a very important bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the Majority Whip, who has been a strong supporter of veterans issues in this legislative body, Mr. McCarthy.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 2189, legislation that will provide real relief to hundreds of thousands of our nation's veterans. And I first want to thank Chairman Miller, because this bill includes the provisions that are a result of the GAO audit that Chairman Miller and I requested on the Department of Veterans Affairs due to the numerous complaints from veterans in all of our districts who had to wait months and oftentimes years for benefits. The audit confirmed these veterans' worst complaints about the severity of the claims in the backlog. The GAO identified the Los Angeles Regional Office, which serves many of my local veterans in my home district, as one of the worst in the country. According to the current data, 61% of the over 160,000 claims are still backlogged. Recent data from the VA shows that the department processed 100,000 less claims than they planned for fiscal year 2013. Clearly, the VA is unable to implement needed reforms themselves. This legislation today addresses the backlog problems in the VA by focusing on streamlining required paperwork and communications between federal agencies and ensuring continued and, if needed, relentless congressional oversight of the administration timeline to clear the compensation claims backlog. When called to serve the United States of America, our nation's veterans have answered. It is time Congress and the Department of Veterans Affairs answers their call as well. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting our veterans and support this bill to end the backlog. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further speakers. I would encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support H.R. 2189 as amended. Once again, I want to thank Chairman Miller and his staff for working very diligently on this piece of legislation, along with my staff on the minority side for bringing this forward. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maine yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 2189 is a strong step forward in helping to resolve the severe backlog of disability claims that exists today.